Hello and welcome to another UK column interview. My name's Debbie Evans. And, well, the World Health Organization, who have got too much power. Now, last weekend, many of us did stay up through the night to watch as the World Health Assembly, the 77th World Health Assembly held in Geneva, voted to amend the international health regulations. But what about the pandemic preparedness treaty that we've all been waiting for? Because we've all been talking about that a lot, haven't we? And what can we expect from the weekend's goings on? Maybe the WHO, have done us a bit of a favour, but I brought our wonderful expert, James Roguski, who has I don't think James ever sleeps, to be honest, because he seems to watch every single session of the WHO. He stays up all night to watch so that he can report on the latest goings on. And I can tell our viewers and listeners that as I introduce James, it's very early in the morning in California. So, James, thank you so much for agreeing to join us after all the shenanigans last weekend. Welcome back to UK Column.
Well, thanks for having me. And, I pronounce that shenanigans because, they're doing the same thing they've done before and they're doing it all over again. I feel that the collective we, the people who have been pushing back against the WHO and, global tyranny and fighting for our health freedom, we got our butts whooped. And it's astonishing how the vast majority of the alternative media is celebrating some sort of victory. So thank you for having me on, and let's get real with what actually happened. I will touch on what you said. There is a silver lining in this, and so there is reason to go forward with hope and energy. Now is the time to push harder. Now is not the time to claim victory and sit back and go, oh, look at what we did. We got our butts whooped.
Yeah, we absolutely did. And I think the devil's in the detail when it comes to what we listen to and the documents as well. And I want to talk to you about those. One thing that did strike me very hard, James, was that whilst we were all looking for this pandemic preparedness treaty and it never happened, it seemed that some of the things that were planned for the pandemic preparedness treaty have seemed to slither their way in to the international health regulations. And you've been picking up a lot on the documents and you've been picking up a lot on the wordage. And I know that you've said that they are very, very cleverly worded, almost spellcraft, if you like. But one new definition that concerns me a lot, and I'd like you to just elaborate a little bit if you could, is pandemic emergency. What is the definition of a pandemic emergency?
Let me touch on one of the things that you said, just a moment ago. Yes, some of the items that were talked about in the treaty, maybe have seemed to sneak in here. But the real problem has been for the last year. All of this information has been jumbled in people's mind, and the expectations of what these documents were going to be versus what was actually being discussed in them has been completely and totally confused. Now, you said the devil's in the details, and I agree with you, but the angels bring the awareness and the answers to the questions that are raised by these demons that are getting everybody confused. So the difference between what is in the treaty and what is in the amendments starts with the fact that, number one, the silver lining is that they have been forced, or, the universe has conspired to make it be that they got half of the two agreements that they were looking for. And so they wanted to get them both at the same time. But because one of them now, the cards have been laid on the table for people who have eyes to see, if you read the documents and understand what really happened, then you'll know what they're trying to do with the second one, the pandemic treaty. So for clarity's sake, on Saturday night that you mentioned, they did adopt the International Health Regulation Amendments, and that document is readily available. I encourage everyone to read it. I like to give you a guide as to what to look for. But the treaty did not get adopted. They just didn't have time. But there's a lot of things that happened even before the assembly that makes me believe that they are on cruise control right now, because a lot of the stumbling blocks have been settled, and they're shooting to continue the negotiations starting in July on the treaty agreement, framework convention, whatever people want to call it, and may very well put a bookend to the special session that started all of this in December of 2021. And they're shooting for a special session later this year to conclude the treaty. Now, you asked me very specifically about the definition of a pandemic emergency. Well, in the 2005 version of the IHR, they have something called a public health emergency of international concern, PHEIC, or FAKE. Well, the pandemic emergency, I call it a super fake, because if you can just make up a reason to call an emergency, like Tedros did with monkeypox, which is even though his review committee or advisory committee said no, it's really not an emergency, that doesn't matter. He has always had, since he's been in office and since 2005, the ability to declare an emergency. Whether or not it's truly an emergency is subject to question. And so the pandemic emergency that they have defined in here, let me just read it if you don't mind, because nothing like putting it out there and people can read it for themselves. It means a public health emergency of international concern that is caused by a communicable disease. So a lot of people have been fear mongering, oh, Tedros can declare, climate change or gun violence or, whatever other thing. Well, it does have to be a communicable disease. And there's 4 points. It has or is at high risk of having wide geographical spread to and within multiple states. Well, what's the definition of wide? I don't know. Number 2, is exceeding or is at high risk of exceeding the capacity of health systems to respond in the countries? Well, how well managed is your health system? 3, is causing or is at high risk of causing substantial social and or economic disruption, including disruption to international traffic and trade. Well, most of that was caused by the government policies. And number 4, requires rapid, equitable, and enhanced coordinated international action with whole of government and whole of society approaches. Now, you may think that that's really specific, but I think that's pretty vague. And it pretty much opens the door to the declaration of a pandemic emergency. But I want to get everybody clear, right? So many people have been saying, oh, Tedros is going to be in control of your healthcare system and tell your government what to do. And it's an attack on national sovereignty and the freedom to choose your drugs and your doctor. No, this is just a little tiny bit more of the same hypnosis and witchcraft and sorcery in the United States, in our law, on the very last day of the Obama administration, the last full day, January 19th, 2017, the CDC put in regulations into the Federal Register that gave criteria for our health minister, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, now Javier Becerra, to declare a public health emergency in the United States. Well, 3 of the things that our secretary can cite to declare an emergency is based on, well, Tedros said so. And so this isn't, a power structure where Tedros will say, you must do this. It's an enabling. And this is just another word, another piece of trickery, another deception. Be afraid, be very afraid. The Director General of the WHO declared this to be a pandemic emergency. Sure, show me the proof. How many people died? That's not a requirement here. This is just adding to the ability to deceive.
James, as I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking, yeah, this is the ability to deceive and to disrupt as well. This is all about disruption. And it seems to me that the WHO are being enabled to make a policy, if you like, or to declare something in order for governments to disrupt their nations. So it's like, well, are we saying that the WHO essentially, or who empowers the who enables the WHO, are more powerful than our own governments because they're able to put in disruptive policies that are all fake? And what kind of recourse do member states and countries have to push back? Can they say, no, Tedros, we're not seeing this in our country, and so therefore we're not going to implement it? Or can we sit down and have a debate about it, to talk about it, to swap evidence and ideas before we all have to go into some kind of lockdown or go into a national global policy? Is there any pushback?
Well, this is where the psychological operation that's been going on within the alternative media and the health freedom movement for the last year went off track almost a year and a half, certainly more than a year ago. Okay, the misunderstanding of who's driving this and where it's headed. Let me redirect your attention to some very interesting things in the amendments that were published, because in their documentation, their nomenclature is that, well, here's the entire document, here's the 2005 amended version, and everything in bold is supposed to be new amendments. So you should be able to look through the document and look for the things that are bold, and you go, oh, well, that's what they changed. But interestingly enough, I've found a number of paragraphs in a full article that were not put in bold. And so the core of this, I learned in college. I had a job reshelving books in the library. When people returned the book, you put it back on the shelf. The best way to hide a book is to put it on the wrong place on the shelf in the library. Take you forever to find it. The best place to hide the truth is right in plain sight where everybody's going to see it, but people don't read the documents. So I want to pull everyone's attention to Article 44 BIS.
Just to add for people that are watching and listening, that the little article that's going to be beneath this interview will have a direct link to the paperwork that James is referring to. So you'll be able to go straight to all of the links in the article beneath.
A couple of months ago, I published an article entitled Red Herrings. And I tried to get people to realize this has never been the WHO attempting to take control, override your national sovereignty, and tell your health, whatever organizations, oh, you've got to do lockdowns and mandates and all that sort of stuff. They even put it in the treaty in Article 24. It was paragraph 3, then they moved it to paragraph 2. This is not about mandates and lockdowns and forced jabs or mask wearing or any of that stuff. This is so much simpler. It's so simple. People haven't been able to see it. It's all about the money. They have said over and over and over, equity, 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 equity. And so in this document, what they settled in on was Article 44 BIS, the coordinating financial mechanism. First paragraph, a coordinating financial mechanism, the mechanism, is hereby established. The purpose of these negotiations was to settle a trade dispute. It was not brought by the WHO to try to take over your life and tell you what to do. Your local officials are entirely capable of overstepping their authority and abusing you at their leisure. And that's what happened over the last 4.5, 5 years. They didn't need any amendments from the WHO. They didn't need a new treaty to abuse the people all around the world. Some areas maybe not so bad. Some areas actually, absolutely horrible. And in some jurisdictions, Western Australia comes to mind, after COVID wound down, they implemented legislation that is so unbelievably dystopian. Whatever comes next is going to be horrific. Those issues, the lockdowns, the mandates, the control of your healthcare system, that is local. You were abused by your school board, your city council, your whatever they call, your provincial government or whatever it might be. This is not about that. And so everybody's been screaming and yelling and barking up the wrong tree. I did another article about a month ago entitled Barking Up the Wrong Tree. Why are you all people looking at the wrong thing? Follow the money. Now, interestingly enough, that article, even though it's all completely brand new, was not put in bold print in this document. Now, the article just before it, Article 44, they made a number of amendments, and it's all about the money. And then when you go to Article 54, BIS, paragraph 4 was also accidentally, right, not put in bold. And it says the committee, this is the implementation committee, shall adopt at its first meeting by consensus terms of reference, which means, they're the way they're going to operate, for the coordinating financial mechanism established in Article 44 BIS. If you were just looking for the bold amendments, you'd go right past these. And it says that the modalities and operationalization and governance is going to be determined whenever they get around to determining it. So there's a whole lot of questions that need to be asked that are hidden, because it's not going to be until that committee meets at some point in the future where they're going to talk about the money to build out what's going on and the whole purpose of this. Now, the reason why these negotiations started in the first place, you have to erase your brain. And I don't really like this word, but I'll use it because people understand it. Pretend that you are a normie and go back to December of 2021 and put yourself in a nation where it was relatively poor and your country was unable to get the jabs that were, you thought were needed to inject into the people of your nation. Then you look over at Canada and you see that Trudeau got a contract for 400 million jabs for 40 million people. The attitude that started this was, hey, you're hogging up all these life-saving jabs. Now, I'm obviously being facetious. We're pretending to be normies here. They said to the WHO, we want a special session of the World Health Assembly. And the declaration that came out of it was the nations who felt they were being shortchanged by not getting the jabs said to the WHO, we need you to convene, meetings to help negotiate an agreement or, a convention agreement or other international instrument. It took a fork in the road and it added in, amendments to the international health regulations. We need to have a worldwide agreement amongst nations ensuring equitable access to pandemic-related products. The purpose of these negotiations was never an attack on sovereignty. It was never a WHO coup to take over your nation's healthcare policy. That has been misinformation for the last year or so. So what we're really dealing with here, and I'm going to go to Article 13, page 12, paragraph 8C. Okay? The Director General shall support states, parties, nations in scaling up and geographically diversifying the production of relevant health products. Well, that raises the question, what the heck is a relevant health product? So you go back to Article 1, and a relevant health product includes pharmaceutical medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, and at the last minute, they added in cell and gene based therapies and other health technologies. Debbie, I know you're the interviewer, but let me ask you a rhetorical question. And I'm not giving you a hard time because a year and a half ago or two, I had to look it up. Are you familiar with the phrase global public good?
No, I'm not, James, at all.
It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Okay, a global public good is something that is infinite. I can get as much of it as I want, and so can you. And I could be greedy and just take everything that I want, but there's still plenty for you. It's infinite. Now that sounds off the top of the head. You go, well, wait a minute, what is that? Well, think about sunshine. Now that's maybe a bad example in England. Okay, I know you had a hot month, but sometimes there's not enough sunshine. But just because I'm out in the sun sunbathing, I could do that all I want, and so can you. Okay, breathing. You could breathe. You could hyperventilate all you want. You can, you're going to be making a lot of carbon dioxide, so you'll get in trouble, with your carbon footprint. But as much as you could possibly breathe, you're not going to, take away my ability to breathe. If you go down to the ocean and get a bucket of water, you can get all the buckets you could ever carry, and I'm still going to be able to go down to the ocean. It's pretty close to infinite. Intellectually, this video is technically a global public good. I can watch it, you can watch it, everybody in the world can watch it, and everybody should. It's endless. Okay. I mean, it'll get censored and it'll get shadow banned, but anybody who wants to watch it can watch it. If you create a PDF document, people can download it. I can read it, you can read it, everybody can read it. Well, in November of 2021, before all of this started, Tedros said, we want, and he used the term at the time, pandemic related products to be a global public good. They want jabs and drugs and diagnostics and masks and all that stuff to be so ubiquitous that it flows like water out of a faucet. You want a jab? How many would you like? Come on down. You want some drugs? Come on down. You need to get something stuck up into your brain to, determine whether or not you think you're ill. We've got all that you could ever possibly want. So Article 13A said that the Director General shall help all of the nations have geographically distributed manufacturing. Let me go back in time to September 30th of 2022 when the nations proposed these amendments. Bangladesh and the African nations proposed Article 13A. They were very similar, but they were a little bit different. And they proposed a allocation mechanism. They wanted Tedros to be in charge of, hey, Canada, you make a lot of those lipid nanoparticles. And, these people in this country, they need that. They're not able to get access to it. So you need to give that to them. They wanted to set it up with Tedros being in charge, very Marxist philosophy of the, control of the means of production and distribution. Well, 4 months later, after the review committee, the International Health Regulations Review Committee, presented their report on February 6th, 2023, they said, yeah, you know what? We don't want to be in that position. We're an advisory body. We don't have the authority to do that in the Constitution, and that would bring liability down upon us. You guys got to think up a better idea. And it mutated into what we have in this document. The nations who called for that actually got more than they asked for. They asked for, dear Mr. Tedros, can you tell those people to give us what we need? It morphed into, well, let's create a financial mechanism and have all kinds of money flow through that mechanism. We won't define it in this document. Next time we meet, we'll give you the details of how that's going to work. And what we want to do is build out the manufacturing capacity around the world in third world countries. Let's take money from wealthy nations, and this is the answer to the question where you said, well, who is above the WHO? It's the banking cartels. It's the IMF. It's the World Bank. It's the International Bank of Settlements. Um, it's the money lenders who went in on the game because they realized, look at all of the money that was made during COVID. We need, they had trouble due to cold storage and, logistics and transport and, limited manufacturing capacity. They're addressing those problems so that they can have massive investment all around the world to build out, laboratories and testing and manufacturing. And there's something that happened on May 24th, Friday, just before all of these last minute negotiations kicked into gear. I wondered, maybe you did or maybe you didn't see the article that I published about the WIPO Treaty, the World Intellectual Property Organization, on Friday, May 24th, signed, they had a signing ceremony. 138 nations signed a new treaty about intellectual property. And what they agreed to settled the difficult negotiation arguments that were going on with the pandemic treaty, because where they were stuck is they were arguing in the WHO about intellectual property. And it's so upside down and backwards. So many people have been saying, "Oh, the WHO, is attacking our national sovereignty," when in essence, these negotiations were exactly the opposite. These negotiations were predicated on primarily the African nations standing up and pushing back against colonialism, corporate colonialism, saying, wait a minute, you remember when Botswana and South Africa identified a genetic sequence? And, believe what you want about viruses, they came up with a data file and they said, well, this is Omicron. And they gave it over to the world, and they were met with travel restrictions, which hurt their economy. And then Pfizer and Moderna put that information into the boosters, made a couple of more $1 billion, and the nations are going, hey, wait a minute, we just got punked, we just got burned. It's like old school colonialism where you go and just exploit the natural resources of a company of a country. You go drilling for oil and gas or a gold mine or a diamond mine or timber from their forests or whatever. They got robbed by Pfizer and Moderna, who took their intellectual property, pirated it, and turned it into money. And so in Article 13A, the proposed amendments, they're like, no, we're not ever giving you any pathogen information unless you promise to share the benefits. Well, they were arguing about that in the pandemic treaty negotiations in the WHO. That's not the right place for that. So they bopped over across town and signed a treaty that essentially deals with that issue. In the future, anyone who applies for a patent and wants the genetic information from some type of pathogen to be incorporated into that patent, they have to identify where they got that information from. And that's how they would track royalties. Oh, you're making all kinds of money. You use this genetic information. You owe us. That opened up the floodgates. And so during the World Health Assembly, they were supposed to make a decision about the amendments in the treaty. And now that that had happened, they said on Tuesday, the 28th, hey, hold on a moment. We're going to put together a secret drafting group. And they worked to the wee hours of the morning every day, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday into Saturday. And they hammered out an agreement. This is a financial contract. This is the WHO saying, hey, we got that IP stuff settled. We'll help you figure out how to get the money from wherever we can find the money. We'll work that out later at a meeting of the implementation committee, whenever the heck they get around to doing that. And the money that is going to be redirected through all of these many financial resources is going to build out the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex in order to make drugs and jabs and diagnostics flow like water from a faucet. They want those products to be a global public good. Now, why didn't they do that with, vitamin A and vitamin D and vitamin C and zinc and, herbal remedies and all that sort of stuff? Well, there's no money in that. This is big pharma working with, um, Mr. Global, as Catherine Austin Fitts calls it, to build out the industry that is enormously profitable. Because if you can go looking for a pathogen, bring it into a laboratory, turn it into a genetic sequence that is very, very scary, and have the pharmaceutical industry make all of these products and put billions of dollars worth of products into the WHO's global distribution and logistics hubs, when you scare people and everything is right there ready and waiting to go to get stuck into somebody's arm or shoved down their throat or stuck up their nose, they're solving the problem that they had. They had a logistics problem. This isn't a health problem. This is designed to decrease your health and increase their wealth. Now, it's easy to miss because everybody's been talking about everything else under the sun. And they buried this information in the middle of their document, and they conveniently forgot to bold some of the important aspects of it. Please don't anybody believe me, right? I'm just a carpenter. What do I know, right? I fix up old furniture, like this is behind me. But I can read, and if you just follow the money, it'll, you'll find the criminals at the end of it. That's what this is all about. This is about a money deal to build out big pharma around the world so they can make poisons and biological weapons flow like water from a faucet.
Oh my goodness, James, there's so much to unpack there. But basically, what I'm hearing you say is that the developed countries are going to be piling money into the WHO in order to siphon out to underdeveloped countries in order to pump out a load more mRNA, jabs, pretty much anything they can think of. But I want to bring you back actually, because when you said there's so much to unpack there, health products, and you mentioned cell and gene products, and that's an immediate red flag in my head,
Mhm.
because basically what I understand is that Tedros has now got the ability to upscale all of these products. And when we say upscale, we meaning back to Patrick Vallance and the Gates, Melinda Gates, their 100-day mission. So not only do we now have the money to fund the upscaling with more manufacturing facilities, and we're seeing that in the UK. We've never been a vaccine manufacturer, and yet all of a sudden we've got Moderna popping up with a vaccine manufacturing centre here. We've also got a vaccine manufacturing industrial complex as well being built here. So everything that you're saying makes perfect sense. But the cell and gene products and catapults and genomics and surveillance are all ringing alarm bells in my head, as when you said too, and I had to chuckle a little bit because you mentioned those two words that nobody likes, carbon footprint. And I'm thinking, how many private jets went to Geneva for a week? How much was the carbon footprint for all of those countries
I
to
thought
go
the
to
same. I
Geneva?
thought the same as I
It's
was
not
watching it.
cheap,
Yeah.
is it?
Someone that I know in Australia put in a FOIA request, and one of the documents that they received was for one trip for two, I don't want to say delegates, but two representatives to go to the negotiations, for the amendments and the treaty, to go from Australia to Geneva for one series of discussions was $47,000. And so, the money, I mean, multiply that times how many times did they go back and forth, and how many nations around the world, and so forth. They spent millions upon millions of dollars just in these negotiations. And what is the carbon footprint of the pandemic agreement? If somebody wants to try to calculate it, that would be interesting. That's all a sham anyway, so don't worry about it. Carbon dioxide, helps plants grow, and that's a whole nother story. But the point here is our movement has been declaring victory because they had been misdiagnosing what was actually going on in these negotiations. Now, there's another point, and I think we have a little bit of time to talk about another point. Way back in November of 2022, I was looking for the amendments to the international health regulations that had been submitted, but they were not yet made public. They weren't made public until December of 2022. And while I was searching, I came upon the B20 meeting. It comes after the G20, and it was in Bali that year. And the Indonesian health minister let the cat out of the bag. He said a couple of things. First and foremost, he was talking about something that he knew was going to happen the next month in December. And what that was that the United States Defense Department had been working, and they had settled in on the negotiations, and it got passed into law and signed by Biden in December of 2022, where we pledged $5 billion over the next 5 years to the World Bank Pandemic Fund. So if you haven't read about the Pandemic Fund, go to my Substack and search for Pandemic Fund, and you'll see what they're doing. In 2023, they dished out several $100 million to nations around the world to start building out these networks. And what he said to the audience of business leaders in Indonesia, the World Bank Pandemic Fund is just about to get rolling. This is a spectacular business opportunity. Go invest. And so one of the things that caught my eye with all of these negotiations going on with the treaty and the amendments is, and I'm going to just find the section here. There were these, I'm going to be mean a little bit and say there were these parasites and vultures, circling around the carcass of, these negotiations, looking for a bone to pick. All of the civil society organizations and non-state actors and non-government organizations and foundations and nonprofits or whatever. Everybody wanted this negotiation to continue. They wanted it to be successful. And if you go to page 31, Article 44 BIS 2E, the financial mechanism shall leverage voluntary monetary contributions for organizations and other entities supporting the nations. So, pick your favorite charity that is maybe doing some things that are a little bit nefarious, and they're willing to do what the WHO or the banking establishment want them to do. They're lined up to get funding. Think Planned Parenthood or Doctors Without Borders or whatever. Some of these organizations may do good things, and some of these organizations may really be a front, an AstroTurf, not really a grassroots, but a fake grassroots, an AstroTurf organization that comes into countries and does things that, they want you to believe are wonderful, but maybe not so much. Maybe they're not in the best interest, to, like the Rotary International wants to spend tens of millions of dollars, giving polio vaccines. Well, one of the things that they crossed out in the annex of the amendments is they no longer have to report on wild type polio virus because there really isn't any. It's all vaccine derived. I mean, they're causing problems under the guise of solving problems so that the money just keeps flowing. And so that one point, 44 BIS, paragraph 2E, that's where this is what I have referred to as 21st century upgrade to fascism. Fascism was defined, maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, but people attribute it to Benito Mussolini, that it's government and corporations working together to take advantage of the little people. Well, when you add a third leg to that, it becomes a triad, it becomes very stable and very powerful. All of these public private partnerships with all of these non government organizations, the government realizes that the government is constrained on a certain level by a constitution or a bill of rights, and there's things that they cannot do. So they contract it out to corporations or NGOs. And then the NGOs get, millions and millions of dollars, and they go do the bidding of their overlords. Happily, because the money is flowing, they make wonderful salaries. The WHO published their financials in 2023. They had over 9,000 employees earning an average of $131,000 a year. 30% of their budget went to salaries. So, this is all about the money, and the money is going to be used to make poisons and biological weapons and things that, I spoke to someone who said uh, that their daughter would not let them see their grandchildren unless they were tested. So they gave in, they got tested, and when they scraped a sample of your genetic material off the top of their nasal pharynx, they started having blood, spinal fluid, cerebral fluid rather, draining into their nasal. They ended up paralyzed from a PCR test. Okay? These are murder weapons. Run death is near, midazolam. They didn't have enough. The UK had plenty. They bought all of France's, as I understand, and were able to insert, uh, I believe it's the Liverpool Protocol, so that everybody could have a good death. This is what they're trying to turn into a global public good. And so the psyop about, oh, Tedros is trying to take over the world and wants to tell your government how to, do healthcare and lockdowns and mandates. It's going to attack your national sovereignty. It's exactly the opposite. This was nations saying, these are our genetic resources. We're going to stand our ground. And unless you pay us for that core raw material, think of the colonial times where natural resources were exploited by nations. And now it's corporations through the Convention for Biological Diversity in 1992. There was supposed to be an agreement that was an access and benefit sharing, where if corporations came in and looked at some herb or some, native healing techniques and went back and changed those chemicals a little bit to turn it into a pharmaceutical, they were supposed to share the benefits. Well, you just put a P in front of the access and benefit system, you get pathogen access and benefit sharing system. These negotiations have always been about a couple of things that are surrounded by money. The nations got burned when they handed over their sovereign biological resource, genetic information, and they're not going to let that happen again. They want a piece of the pie. And so at the same time, they weren't able to get the fruit of that. If it's a poison fruit, but the jabs that were created, Canada bought up 10 times what they wanted. Everybody else bought up 10 times what they wanted. If they would just wake up and realize the core fraud that's being perpetrated, the diagnostics are dangerous, let alone, fraudulent and inaccurate. The drugs are murder weapons, and so are the jabs. But they don't care, because it's not about improving your health. It's about degrading your health so that they can multiply their wealth. I know we're not quite ready to summarize it, but my pre-final word before my final word is follow the money. And look in these documents and read them and understand that this has always been about equity. If you've been paying any attention to what's going on, with these negotiations, why is everybody always talking about equity? Well, equity means money. You buy a home, you have a mortgage, you pay some of it down, you do some improvements. the value, the price goes up. You say that you have equity in your home. If you buy stock in a company, you have an equity stake. You own part of that company. You have equity. The nations around the world were clamoring for equity, but they asked for equitable access to pandemic related products. Originally, they said, can we set it up so that the director general tells nation A to give us, give what they're making to nation B? And this ended up to be more than they asked for. Oh no, we're not going to do it that way. Let's have this financial mechanism, which is not necessarily a fund. It's more like, oh, some oligarch calls up the WHO's coordinating financial mechanism office, and they go, look, I'm an oligarch in this country, and I want to get hooked up with some financing so I can build an mRNA manufacturing plant. Oh, okay, great. We'll connect you to the World Bank or the IMF or some other banking cartel. We'll get you the money. Maybe we'll get you a grant. We'll help you write the grant. Okay, you're doing something that we want you to do because you're going to be making these poisonous products be a global public good. Now, that's not going to benefit the average person. That's going to poison the average person, but it's going to make a whole heck of a lot of profit. Now, in the treaty, they want to institute One Health surveillance. Well, they say that that's, to go looking for pathogens with pandemic potential. I put an extra P in there. They're looking for pathogens with pandemic profiteering potential. And if they find them, cha-ching, the money starts flowing. Give them the genetic sequence. If that goes into a patent, it's being tracked so that somebody can get royalties. And if it's turned into a product, they'll fill up the WHO warehouses. They proudly proclaimed that they have a 20,000 square meter facility just in one of their regions in Dubai. That's 4 football fields. How much corruption could you engender trying to fill up 4 football fields with relevant health products? And so I've dubbed this the new OPEC. It's not the oil producing and exporting countries. It's the Organization of Pandemic Emergency Corporations. They're not necessarily coming to make you get jabbed. Your local officials will handle that for you. They're coming for your money.
James, I've been scribbling down notes, so excuse me while I keep referring to my notes, because there's just a couple of things before we do go to your last word. There's a few questions I've got and a very important point that I'd like you to elaborate on, which could affect every single person watching and listening. So I just want to take you back to a bit of fake news, because actually it wasn't the hottest May in the UK. I don't know where the Met Office have got that from. It's rained more days than I care to remember. So if you're getting that news, you might want to raise an eyebrow to that. But interesting you said about the salaries of the employees of the WHO, because just before we talked today, I went on to have a look and see how much Tedros's salary was. And according to the WHO website, Tedros's salary is €265,000 a year, which is equivalent to about $200,000 a year. And when you mentioned public-private partnerships, we have been focusing very much on UK column on NGOs, public-private partnerships, transfer of assets. And I think you've made it extremely plain today for everybody that we now know that this is basically a massive money laundering operation, organized criminals. And yeah, you're right, follow the money. The one thing that I did pick up too was you mentioned the word diagnostics, and I too have been mentioning the word diagnostics. And the PCR tests, for example, the very sad story that you said there, there's a little tiny structure at the top of the nose, and it's called the cribriform plate. And it's very fragile, really fragile. That's why we tell kids not to stick anything up their nose, because once they do, it's very difficult to get it back down again, and it can be very dangerous. So a PCR test right from the get-go, I was always, as an ENT nurse, I was always very concerned about, because you'd have to have the head at a certain angle. I would always be supervised, possibly by either a senior nurse or a consultant. So when I saw these sticks being shoved up people's noses through car
It's
windows,
horrifying. It's horrifying.
I was absolutely horrified. And the other thing too that you mentioned there was the Liverpool pathway, is what I think you were referring to, where they were pretty much killing everybody off. Bill Gates has got his germ team, of course, looking for pathogens, looking for bugs, looking for reasons that they can medicate us. But I just want to ask you very quickly, if I or my children, for example, or my family or friends were abroad and Tedros, for example, called a global emergency and we were in Spain, what kind of things do you think would happen to us given these new amendments or the adopted amendments, and then further on down the line, the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty? Because I know that you've mentioned the word guardianship. And when I heard you talking about guardianship before, it really concerned me. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because potentially we could be in another country and not allowed to leave, or we could be quarantined, or we could be tested, we could be mandated, we could be have a guardian appointed to us. I mean, is this all fake news, or is this a possibility?
This has been in the international health regulations since 2005. In Article 31, it says as plain as day, and the doublespeak is astonishing. Okay, it says, nobody should, force anybody to do anything, but, since you're a sovereign nation, you can do this if you want. And it says that nations can compel travelers to undergo a medical exam, prophylaxis, vaccine, whatever a vaccine is, because the word vaccine is not defined in the international health regulations, or be isolated in quarantine. And so they adopted amendments to Article 24 to employ the conveyance operators. This is part of the fascism I'm talking about. They want the conveyance operators, which a conveyance is a airplane or a cruise boat or train or a bus, and the operator is the company that runs that business, to enforce not the WHO's mandate. This is where everybody's got this completely confused. This is an agreement amongst all of the member nations that if the nation has a policy, they want it to be enforced upon embarkation or disembarkation by the conveyance operator. I know people who, when they traveled, they were put in quarantine. They weren't ill, right? Isolation is what you do for someone who is ill. Quarantine, there's a word in the international health regulations, look it up, suspect. If you're even on the boat, if you're on the plane, and they think, there's some contaminant or some contagion, you have suddenly become a suspect, and the whole entire conveyance could be quarantined. Now, add to that, in Articles 35, there's details about the paperwork that you would need to have, whether it's digital or on paper. And Annex 4 and Annex 6 is where, that's where this actual document, this is an old school vaccine passport, okay? That form, if anybody's ever had one of these when they're traveling, that comes from Annex 6 of the International Health Regulations. They're trying to strengthen that. And this again points to the psychological operation. So many people around the world have been screaming about, we have to defend our national sovereignty. Those articles are a perverse, overblown expression of national sovereignty. All of the nations agreed, if our citizens travel to your country, well, you can do whatever you want to them. But when your citizens come to our country lawfully, we can do whatever we want to them. Now, in the United States and elsewhere around the world, just go right across the border, no problem. But if you want to do so properly, you're at their mercy. Now, there had been a proposed amendment that would have facilitated repatriation, which is exactly what you were asking. but they didn't adopt that one. Somebody spoke up and said, hey, if something happens, people should be able to get back home, but they did not adopt that amendment.
James, before I come to your last word, I want to ask you a last question because there's just so much to ask you. But for anybody watching and listening, please go to James's Substack. All of the links will be in the article beneath this interview because James updates it regularly, like every day. There's a new report, and if there's anything that's coming out of the WHO, James will hear of it first. And I think you've called it the biggest country club because obviously there's so many countries involved in it, and I love that, the biggest country club ever. And I think you also said that we all have to empower ourselves. We have a duty of care to ourselves, really, to read those international health amendments and what's been adopted. Because when we do go abroad, if we do go abroad, or if we know people that are going abroad, we need to be aware of the powers that other countries and other authorities can have on us and what might happen to us while we're out there. And we're definitely not out of the woods. We're far from out of the woods with regards to this. So my final question to you, James, is what's the next date we should be watching out for? What happens next?
The next date is yesterday. Okay. Start paying attention right now. For the treaty, which is on sort of the side burner, they're going to be starting their negotiations up again sometime in July. They have not chosen a date. More to the point, what I want people to understand is that they have laid their cards on the table. I think I said this earlier, but I'll say it again if I did before. They wanted to slam both of these things through. And everyone has been looking all around going, oh, they're attacking our national sovereignty. The WHO is trying to take over the world. They want to have our governments, do what the Tedros says. And they're looking over here and looking over here and looking over here. But they've also been saying over and over and over, equity, equity. We want equity. We demand equity. Okay? They told you exactly what they were doing. It's written in the document. For anyone who has eyes to see, just read it. Please don't listen to anything I say. That's hearsay. I can't tell you how many times people call me up. Oh, did you hear what so and so said? I'm like, yeah, okay, but you got a document, you got some evidence, you got a FOIA request, you got a hidden camera. Somebody's saying something. I've had people listen to me and turn around and say something to the next person and completely mangle the conversation that we just had. It's so important to go to the source. Doesn't matter what somebody says about these documents. It's a whole lot of people in alternative media and in the health freedom movement saying that this is a wonderful victory. Aren't we so wonderful? We stopped the WHO. The pandemic treaty is dead. Donate. Okay. There's a whole heck of a lot of grifting going on in our space. And so I encourage everybody, go look around the internet and everywhere and see what are people saying. And when you go and you read the documents and you go, wait a minute, so and so said this, but that's not what I read in the document. And so said that, and they're all claiming victory. Does this appear to be why is the WHO claiming victory? And people on our side, are claiming victory as well. Could it be both? Did both sides win? I don't think so. I think we got our butts whooped. And it's because people were not reading the documents. They were listening to hearsay about the documents because that's easier. Now, I've tried to make it as easy as possible to point out the things that are important, but don't listen to what I say about it. Read the documents, make up your own mind, reach your own conclusion, And if you think this is wonderful and great because you want all these drugs and jabs and diagnostics to flow like water, so there's an infinite supply, then support the WHO and support the pandemic treaty. Me, I'm going to use every fiber of my being to raise awareness of what this really is, and push back against it and the WHO.
We're so grateful to you, James, for having your finger on the pulse, because you literally have got your finger on the WHO's pulse. And I would encourage everybody to go to James's Substack because, like you said, James, you always go to original sources. So for anybody wanting to see any of the documents that James has mentioned along the way, or any of his previous Substacks, they're all there. All the information's there. James, we always love catching up with you. And no doubt we'll be catching up with you again very soon. I can't thank you enough for getting up so early in the morning, California time. But from this side of the planet, we're going to bid you a goodbye, and we're going to leave, as we always do, with our thanks and our love and your last word. James, thank you so much.
Well, this all started for me a couple of years ago when I was dragged out of bed, compelled to go look on the internet, go search for something, and I ended up finding uh, the amendments that the Biden administration had submitted back in January of 2022. Well, we're having this interview. For me, it was at 7 a.m. in the morning, but I got dragged out of bed at 4 in the morning by some force, and this is how I try to live my life. I just follow what guidance comes, to dig up all of this information so that I could have it be prepared and present it in, a hopefully easy to comprehend manner. Um, my final word is very simple. Do not be afraid. This is not something that people should be afraid of. I'm a very peaceful person, generally very calm and easygoing. But this should get you enraged. It should get you to the point, non-violently, but this enrages me so much that I'm up out of bed at 4 in the morning because, I have things that I can do and I have to do. Now, everyone has their own capacity, they have their own skills, and everyone has life. You've got to pay the bills, you've got to take care of your family, you got to do all the things you've got to do. So, you can dedicate whatever amount of time you want. But step number one is get clear on what just happened. Because, in one sense, this is a silver lining, this is a blessing. They laid their cards on the table. We now know exactly what they're doing. It's not, oh, maybe it's going to be this, maybe it's going to be that, maybe it's going to be the other thing. If you read the document, they've given you their game plan. It should make you furious that they want to take billions of dollars, whether it comes through the World Bank or the, other International Monetary Fund or whatever, so that oligarchs in poor nations who are pretending that they want to stop the next pandemic, but are really plotting to create it and profit from it. The simple thing that I want to leave everybody with is I'm here to help. You can give me a phone call. I'm in California. It's 310-619-3055. Now is the time to wake people up to the fraud that has been perpetrated over the last 4.5 years. The diagnostics, the drugs, the jabs, they're all fraudulent. They're designed to scare you, take away your health so that they can redistribute the wealth. And once you realize that this is just absolutely, completely, and totally evil, right? Don't listen to the demon on that shoulder. Listen to the angel. A lot of times people say the devil's in the details. The angels will bring awareness and the answers that you need to push back against what they're doing and go forward to make this world a better place. So if you want to join me in that quest, reach out. I'm here to help best I can. And, thanks for the opportunity for having me. I appreciate it.